Okay. Okay, so starting over again, good afternoon. My name is Angel Martinez Laredo. I'm the Director of Higher Education Educator Support Services here at the Maine Department of Education. I'm really happy to be here with you today to discuss long-awaited completion of Chapter 115. It's long in the process, and I'm sure a lot of you have questions and ideas and thoughts about it, but we're happy to be able to present that information to you. And as I was saying earlier, we have two distinguished celebrities with us who will be speaking to you. The first one is our certification chief, and that is Stephanie Fife, who will be talking this afternoon. And then also direct from a conference in Presque Isle, we have the distinguished associate or deputy commissioner, Dan Chuda, who recently was awarded the Distinguished Award of the FFA organization. So congratulations to you, Commissioner. And so with that, we start, and I also have my other colleague, the other associate commissioner, and that's Chelsea Fortune Trimble, who is with us today, and she might say some words later on as we go forward. And we have other folks from the DOE present with us, so we're happy that our colleagues are with us today, and happy that you're here with us, because we originally didn't know how many people were going to come, as this is something that was just passed, and we want to be able to share this information. So with that, I'm going to transition over to our first speaker, who is Stephanie Fife.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I think I actually have spoken to quite a few of you that are here with us today. So I'm going to go ahead and just get started. Welcome to the first of three pieces of our webinar series. There are extensive changes to 115, as you probably imagine, since it's been 2 years in the making. And so we wanted to make sure that we were here to provide support and answer any questions that you have. So today, we really wanted to cover, how did we get here? What is the background? And how did we get through this process to the final product that we now have? On May 25th, also at 5 p.m., we're going to do an overview of the Chapter 115 changes. So definitely put that on your calendar. Don't want to miss it. And then also June 8th at 5 p.m., that is designed really for LCC support chairs, but at the same time, anyone is welcome. And it's really designed on how best to support educators as they move through the certification process and moving from one type of endorsement to another. So we hope that you can come to all three. Yes, Mr. Laredo?
I just kind of forgot, to mention, as we go through the process, you can raise your hand, and that way if you can press the raise hand, and I'll be sort of the person to say that you have the opportunity to speak. But also, if you have specific questions, they're really into the virtual weeds, if you will, please, you can send them to us by email or call us, because we want to be able to give you more of a thread, higher up presentation this afternoon, as opposed to really looking at specific issues that you may be encountering, or you might specific questions you may have. Those you can address them to either Stephanie or myself. We'll be more than happy to answer and set some time apart for you. Sorry about that, Stephanie.
No, that's okay. Thank you very much. So just make sure, tell your friends, tell your colleagues, this is a great opportunity to get some of the information that you need. And we will be recording and posting these on the website as well. Hopefully just the following day from when we deliver the webinars. So thank you and welcome. So the agenda for today is we want to talk about what is this rule, Chapter 115? What is it all about? Why was a new version necessary at this point? Who was involved in this process? When does it become effective? A very important question. And how to stay up to date with certification regulations and knowing what's happening when and how you can play a part in that. So that's our agenda for today. And without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Deputy Commissioner Chuda.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Angel, and thanks everyone for being here this evening. So I'll jump right in. This is kind of the point in which we make sure you're on the right plane heading to the right direction. But this is chapter 115, which is officially the credentialing of education personnel. It is a major substantive rule, which has significance, which we'll get into a little bit later. It essentially means it's a more involved process for making a change to a rule. And it's also of note, a rule of the state board. So the State Board of Education for Maine is more or less the owner of this rule. And we at the department obviously play a supportive role as changes are made, but also then implement the rule once it has been completed. This rule happens to be extra special because there are two parts, which makes it a rather lengthy rule. But there are two parts. They get posted separately. And part one really has overarching requirements under the general requirements for all certificates. It also has language about things like some things that are not as pleasant, but like revocation, suspensions. It also talks about, as Stephanie was referring to, the local credentialing committees, the LCCs, and how those are established. So pretty overarching and high level components of part one. And then in part two, there are specifics. So if you wanted to know what it meant to become an early childhood education certification certified teacher, part two is where you would go to determine what the specific semester hour requirements were and other courses. So if someone was looking to either renew or become certified in something for the first time, it's probably part two that somebody would look up to find what they were going to need in order to be certified. So I also wanted to make sure that folks knew that at the end of the day, statute is always what takes precedent over anything else. So whatever is in law is what we work with. And then in cases like certification, law gives the authority to the state board to make rules about the topic, in this case, certification. So in the process to make changes to chapter 115, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a minute, it became necessary for some of the statute to change. The direction that we were hoping the rule would go was not going to work unless there were some changes to law. And so there happened to be two bills introduced of significance. There were actually many, and there always are every session, new bills that somehow, in some way, shape, or form, tried to address certification. But two of note in the last 2 years were these two. I believe we're going to post these slides, probably a PDF format, along with the recording, if you would like to take a look at this a little bit closer. The links are there, but if you go to the legislature's website for the 130th session, 1189 was a rather comprehensive bill that was introduced to make many of the changes that were necessary to realize the changes in rule. There's another important component which makes things sometimes complicated, messy may be the right word, and that gave candidates options if they met certain qualifications to choose whether they wanted to get certified under the old rule or the new rule. So more specifics about that in LD 1189, which is now law. And then more recently, in the second quote unquote shorter session of the 130th, LD 1933 was actually the resolve that established the rulemaking process for the legislature for Chapter 115. It also gives them the ability to require changes coming back to the state board. And again, we'll talk about the full process in just a minute, but 1933 was important. Since we're talking about 115 for just a second, there is another piece of legislation that may be important to folks, although it's not doesn't have an impact on Chapter 115, but that's 1207, which enables completers of the learning facilitator programs at Eastern Maine Community College to become certified if they apply as an EdTech 3. So we're not going to get into that probably even next week either with some of the changes, because we're sticking to specifics on 115, but there was a third piece of legislation that of note that you may want to learn more about, and we're happy to answer any questions that you may have as a follow-up on 1207. Okay, now I'm ready. Thank you. So why was a new version necessary? Well, in 2019, there was actually a version of Chapter 115 that was in the works, and the legislature and the state board and the department started to discover some complications that were in the language. And so it was determined at that point that the changes were significant enough to take a pause in the rulemaking process. And so what ultimately happened was the resolve came back from the legislature to the state board, who has, as I mentioned previously, the ownership of this rule, and they voted not to adopt Chapter 115. And instead, what was decided was to take that pause and really start from almost scratch. It wasn't entirely rewritten. The version of 115 that is new is not, a blank slate that was rewritten, but it was a pretty comprehensive overhaul of the rule itself. And so that started a process again in 2019 of looking at this in a new lens. And so what we were, and by we, I mean the Department of Education and State Board, we wanted to create a rule that very specifically addressed and balanced two things. And these are two tricky things to balance, but it's the desire for well-qualified individuals. In no way, shape, or form did we want to say that we're lessening the expectations for people. We want to have certified people in the state of Maine be recognized as well-qualified to do the job. But we also wanted to make sure that we had a robust educator workforce, and that meant that there needed to be a few things that were included in the process. Overall, our priorities were to make the rule clear as possible, to make it as simple as possible, and make it as flexible as possible. And those three adjectives can sometimes conflict with each other, but I think we made some headway. In order to be successful, there were lots of people that had involvement in this process. So as I mentioned, the department and the state board decided to endeavor in this work. For a little bit of time, the department led the way with the crafting of a new version. But what we were excited about and introduced to the state board was the possibility of using what's called consensus-based rulemaking. It's not often used. It's a bit novel, particularly for a rule this size and this complex, to use a consensus-based rulemaking process. It's not something we made up. It actually exists in statute, so it is a possibility at any point when rulemaking is happening. But it can get a little bit more complex in that there's more people involved in the rulemaking, which we believed would end up producing a better product. And I think we're pretty proud about the fact that that is exactly what we achieved. So almost simultaneously, the legislature had requested a renewal of sorts of the Professional Standards Board. Again, this was in statute. It's a body that makes advisement to both the state board and the commissioner in matters related to certification. There are a few things that are specified in statute around the duties of the Professional Standards Board, but they are generally around certification topics. So that Professional Standards Board was newly seated. That goes through a process of where the governor nominates individuals for that. And we figured, well, these are folks that are going to be interested in certification and may have an interest right out of the gates to be involved in this work. So we actually reached out to all the new members of the Professional Standards Board, and we added a few other folks too that would have potential interest in helping us write a draft of the new rule, and said, hey, you're not even a I don't even think the Professional Standards Board had its first meeting, and we were already reaching out to them to tap into their expertise. And almost all of them agreed to do it. The hitch was that we were going to start doing this work, and it was probably going to happen during the summer. And understandably, people were, for lots of reasons, not able to make it. But there was a good majority of the new Professional Standards Board members that were willing to take part in this process. And in statute, it calls for membership to come from all sorts of different roles within education. There were ed techs, there were teachers, there were principals, superintendents, there were curriculum directors, there are members of the university. So wide-ranging education stakeholders were involved in this process. And then, like I said, we supplemented with a few folks as well to round out the slate. Now, little did we know that at the beginning of March, there was going to be this thing called coronavirus that came along, and it impacted our timeline a bit. But in the end, because everything actually transitioned to Zoom, these folks came from all over the state, and we were, through the course of the summer of 2020, where we started this work, meeting weekly. And I just want to go on record again to thank that group of dedicated professionals who were willing to work with us on this rule writing. And so we did, for the course of the summer and into the fall, spent an enormous amount of time, again, weekly. I think we took 1 or 2 weeks off. We took like July 4th off, I think, and one other week. And then we're prepared to, I want to say it was October or so, make a presentation to the State Board Certification Higher Education Committee about the changes that the consensus-based rulemaking committee were interested in seeing. Just about simultaneously, those same proposals were being made to the Professional Standards Board, and with their support, which was unanimous throughout the process, and in its entirety, the Professional Standards Board made recommendations to move forward with the changes that the consensus-based rulemaking committee had designed and proposed. The other group, not quite sequentially, because Stephanie will talk in just a little bit about the entire rulemaking process. But these folks, the department, the state board, the consensus-based rulemaking committee, the professional standards board, came up with new language for 115 in many ways. There were changes, there were additions, there were deletions. And ultimately, because it's a major substantive rule, it does have a route that takes it through the legislature, the full legislature. And so that was that second LD that I mentioned, 1933, brought the rule to the Education and Cultural Affairs Committee of the legislature. They worked on it a bit and did expect some minimal, actually, changes to be made, minimal in quantity, I would say. So there were opportunities for folks to weigh in to that process as well. Ultimately, it went to the full legislature, was voted unanimously in both the House and the Senate, and the governor signed it. And that's essentially, in a nutshell, how we have a new document. I do want to point out that the public has had a number of different opportunities. Not only are all of our meetings, all the state board meetings, all the consensus-based rulemaking meetings, all the professional standard board meetings, and all of the educational and cultural affairs meetings public, there are multiple opportunities throughout for public input into the process. Very specifically, the State Board of Education's Certification Higher Education Committee had, in combination with a few of the state board meetings where there are final and formal votes, over 70 meetings just devoted, almost primarily, some of them had other topics, but in some way, shape, or form, around 70 or so meetings related to this version of 115. Each one of those meetings with opportunity for public comment and input. There were actually also, and again, Steffi will get into this process, but there are actually 2 comment periods, formal 30-day comment periods for people to weigh in, and they did to the proposals that were being made. So again, I think because of the nature of this being a comprehensive rule that impacts many people's lives and jobs, it was important to us, and we saw, I think, the benefit of having public input into this rule. This was not something that just went out quickly in 30 days and was wrapped up and ready to move on. Again, it took almost, well, over 2 years for this work to occur, and public involvement was critical to that.
Okay, so this gets to me with this process that has a lot of different steps to it. So the process that I put down here on this little winding road that does have a second slide attached to it is the generic process. Now that doesn't mean that we don't take a few little trails here and there off the route, and I'll explain a little bit more about that.
Oh, you did? I'll freeze it.
Let me see if I can mute. Angel, you might have to.
Yeah,
Oh, there we go. Okay. So first, the Professional Standards Board that Deputy Commissioner Shuda was just discussing. They are now a group of individuals who will annually work with the state board to provide recommendations. So moving forward, that's one of the places where this could start. It didn't start that way this time, as you all just learned, but that is typically how it would start. The next step is that the state board certification committee decides if changes are needed. So they decide if we need to propose this, if there's enough of a concern to make some changes. The DOE works with drafting, editing, process, the communication, so kind of pulling everyone together to move it forward. Then the state board committee votes. So once they have a document that they like, they vote if they want to push it to the full state board of education. At that point, oh, my little thing, I'm sorry, I didn't follow the road correctly. So the DOE edits, and then the state board committee presents draft language for public comment. So that is one of the times that the public can participate in the public comment period. It's typically for 30 days, and people can provide written testimony or come and do it in person as well. The next step is that changes may be added to the draft based on those comments. So all of those comments that come in are taken very seriously, and I don't even know how many of those 70 some odd meetings were actually dedicated to going through the comments one line at a time and making sure everyone's concerns were understood and addressed. So after those decisions are made, the state board committee votes to bring the draft 115 to the full state board of education. At that point, there is potentially another public comment period. There's all kinds of places to weigh in. And then they vote if they would like to submit it, the draft legislation, to the Secretary of State, where it's then assigned an LD. In this situation, it was LD 1933. At that point, the Education and Cultural Affairs Committee from the legislature receives the LD, and then it goes into the docket to be scheduled for public hearings and then work sessions. Now, before I go on to the next slide here, a couple things I want to point out. All of these little bubbles that have the black boxes, these are all points where the public can weigh in on what's going on and make sure that their voice is heard. I know it's not always easy to understand when you can, put your voice heard, but these are all places where you absolutely can do it. So please take note of that. We want to hear from everyone. So 9 steps right there. If I can find my own roadmap, follow my own roadmap, then it actually goes into the committee after the public hearing, after the work sessions. Then if the committee, remember I said that this was generic, it can go a lot of different ways, but if the committee votes ought to pass, then the bill has to go through the House, Senate, and Appropriations to then move forward. If the proposed document makes it through there, then it's sent back to the State Board of Education to review and to vote again to make sure that that is the document that they want. If the state board then votes to adopt the final version of 115 after it has gone through the yellow brick road, it is then filed with the Secretary of State, which is where we are right now. So the state board has voted to approve it. It has been filed within the Secretary of State's office. And so this bubble that says new regulations become effective 30 days after filing, we are in that period right now. And then of course, the next step is implementing to the field and making sure that everyone understands how this impacts them, what the benefits are, and how best to move forward. Dan, would you, it's a very complicated process, right? That can go in a number of different ways. So is there anything that you would add to that?
Nope, I think we're good. Every process obviously has its own little tweaks. For instance, I mentioned earlier that this one had 2 comment periods. So there are little variations along the way, but this should give folks a good kind of broad overview of how the rulemaking process proceeds.
Yeah, it's very interesting in being in being the coordinator for certification. I actually really enjoy the conversations where people call in and they think that not me, but I don't know, someone just made these rules up. And so then explaining to them how this all works, and they're always, quite amazed at the process. So it's actually quite fun to have those conversations with people. Okay, so the big question right now is, okay, the 30-day waiting period, when does it become effective? So it was adopted by the state board. The new rule becomes effective on June 11th. Make sure you write that down, June 11th. Now, the next question really is, where can I find it? So all of the DOE related statutes and rule chapters can be found at this link. If you go to any of the DOE websites, just scroll down to the bottom on the footer, and there are some really amazing resources there for you. So if you scroll down to any of the pages on the right-hand side of the page, you'll see this related links. And if you click on the main DOE rule chapters, not only will 115 part 1 and part 2 be there, but as well, all of the DOE rule chapters will be there as well. So it's a real nice resource to make sure that you know how to access if you would like to.
The only caveat is don't go there right now.
Right.
Because it hasn't been posted yet, the new one. We've gotten word from Secretary of State's office that we're hoping by next Wednesday, so a week from today. So next week, when you join us, of course, again, for our part 2 of the series, we'll be able to share with you the good news that the new version of the rule will be posted exactly where Stephanie is pointing you to.
Yes, as you can imagine, we're all working very hard to update websites and links and support documents and all those fun things. So stay tuned to lots of great things coming out. One of the challenges that I hear from folks that call in and message into the certification office is that I want to be heard. I want to do this. How can I be aware of what's going on? The biggest things I always tell people are to make sure that you sign up for the newsletters. That also can be done on the footer of the web pages. It is a great resource. You will get the priority notices that the DOE sends out. It's a great way to keep up to date on the most important things. We also have a great social media presence. So please feel free to follow the DOE on social media. And then, of course, if you are working in a school, there are lots of groups that people are a part of, whether it's MEA, MPA, MADSEC, MASL, there's so many different ones. So that's another resource for you, as they are certainly always keeping up to date on some of those changes there.
So at this point, Stephanie, I think we can maybe it's about 5:29. And so maybe if folks have questions, we can entertain them from the floor before we move forward.
Okay, are there questions before we move forward at all?
I see
Yes.
Mary's hand up.
So I'm having trouble with my mute button. So back in the last year or two, there was some emergency legislation passed and the DO and certification wasn't ready to implement that. Is there going to be a delay with this piece? Because I have a lot of people on emergency certificates because of that implementation and somebody on a waiver for this year for that purpose.
Great question. So right now we are working as fast and diligently as we can to get as much as we can up by June 11th. It's one of those situations where you don't know what you don't know, right? So our plan is that everything's going to work perfectly and it's all going to be there June 11th. That is my hope and wish, Mrs. Witten. I can't call you Mary as my old science teacher. Yes. But at the same time, I don't want to make promises that, that I'm not capable of keeping if we run into challenges, right? So if that happens, please feel free to reach out to me. We're always willing to work with people and help them figure out how best we can make it work. That said, just keep in mind that we're working as furiously as we can to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Thank you. Any more questions? As you folks are developing your questions, I wanted to acknowledge that our chair of the state board has joined us, and that's Fern Desjardins, and she is here. I'm not putting her on the spot or anything, but it's great that she joined us for this, as this is also a big chunk of it is part of the state board process. So any more questions? Okay, well, I counted to 10. And okay, Fern says, thank you. And so with that, I think we can call it a close for today. We want to appreciate you for joining us on this first of 3 series of Chapter 115 updates. And also want to thank especially our 2 speakers, Stephanie and the Deputy Commissioner Chuda, and then our Associate Deputy Commissioner has just joined us as well. That's Chelsea Ford and Trimble. Really happy. And I'm going to also acknowledge another colleague from the DOE, and that's Deanna Doran, who's with us this afternoon too, for joining us. Thank you for that. And we have a salutation from Madawaska, way up there. So great. So without anything, Stephanie, I think you had one more slide.
Yes, just key things to remember as we part ways for 1 week. Hopefully we'll all see you again Wednesday, right? In case you hear this, if people are concerned about new rules and how it impacts what they currently have, please remember that whatever you have now, you can always renew. So any educator that is concerned about that, please know that that is never taken away from you. Just make sure that those educators, whether it's you or your colleagues, don't let those certificate lapse. Just make sure that you renew in a timely fashion and you will always retain that certificate. Again, the new regulations go into effect June 11th. We are doing everything we can to make sure that this is as seamless as possible. If you don't find answers on the certification page, we are working to update that as quickly as we can. The best way to reach us is at cert.doe@maine.gov. I believe everyone has experienced what happens when 20 people call our line at the same exact time. There's only so much that you can do with that. But when it comes to that email, we have multiple people that have access to that email address that are trying to respond to those as fast as we possibly can. So it's a great way to reach us. And then of course, that is our website, maine.gov/DOE/cert. So you can take a look at that as we continue to enhance and provide additional support there.
Great. Well, again, thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Please know that we recorded this session and we're going to uploaded in our YouTube section. So make sure you give us a like and enjoy the afternoon. And we're happy to give you back almost half an hour of your time. So again, thank you very much, and we'll see you soon next week. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.